Science of the Paranormal, an overview. I'll give you just a little bit of background to this. Back in 1980 something, this is a paper published by the Liberal Catholic Institute of Studies for people who are doing their diploma in religion studies. Well, I was doing it, I've done it as well. And the original paper was written by the Reverend Richard W. Brooks, PhD, who's I think I mentioned him the other day. He is a New York Theosophist. He passed away some time ago. Detroit, was it? Oh, all right. But if you look on here, it says appendix by Brian Harding. So I did quite a bit of reading and study on parapsychology in those days, but I haven't done a lot since, so I'm sure there are people here who are more up to date than I am with the subject, hence the overview bit, because if you think I've left something out, well, it's only an overview, right? I'm not silly, I've done this before. Anyway, we better get going because you'll all be deafening me with rumbling tummies. In my previous talk, which I think was only yesterday, I referred to a classification of phenomena by Richard Brooks, and I've already explained where it comes from. Yeah, so I had that up yesterday, and just to recap, on the right we've got a group of phenomena listed under the general heading of survival research. And this includes hauntings, medium, mystic, and past life phenomena, reincarnation, and all those things. And on the left, we've got phenomena under the general heading of parapsychology, but subheads of ESP and PK, extrasensory perception and psychokinesis. And you can see the different categories. And Richard Brooks has a list about twice as long as that, but I just put those up as samples. Now in this presentation I want to mention selected aspects of modern parapsychology research. I'll also refer to some of the personalities who've conducted this research. And then in the last section I'll have a look at some of the recent work published by Dean Radin in his book Supernormal. Some of you might have seen that. Psi phenomena go back millennia, reported psi phenomena, especially in the East, of course. But Richard Brooks, with some justification, suggests that in the West, the Roman Catholic Church was the first organized body to investigate these things because they wanted evidence of miracles. You had to have, it still is, isn't it? You have to have 2 miracles and a few other sort of referees or something to make you a saint. That is quite an interesting thought, actually. I mean, are miracles always saintly? Not sure about that. I'm not sure about that. Anyway, because of the need to validate miracles, Prospero Lambertini, 1675, I got that there, 1758, who later became Pope Benedict XIV, was the Vatican's chief investigator. And interestingly, he discovered psi principles which have been confirmed by modern research. The reference is his treatise De Servorum Dei Beatificatione et Beatorum Canet. So if you like to read that sometime. The first serious attempt in more modern times to investigate metaphysical phenomena in a quasi-scientific spirit was made by the London Dialectical Society. I hadn't come across them before until I was researching this subject. At a meeting of the council of that society in January 1869, a committee was appointed, quote, to investigate the phenomena alleged to be spiritual manifestations and to report thereon. 1869, that was obviously the The Fox sisters would have been known then, because that was 1848. But the happenings at the Eddy farmhouse were not yet, in existence. They came, that was 1873, I think it was. And then, of course, came the formation of the Society for Psychical Research, also in London in 1882, and I had pictures of the guys involved in that. Studies in modern parapsychology began in the 1930s with the work of Joseph Banks Rhine, and here's a different picture of him. He looks very severe in that, doesn't he? I think someone might have criticised his experiments just a moment before the camera clicked. We've already seen something of Rhine's work, but I'd like to add a couple of further comments because it was an important period of research during which practical and mathematical methodologies were developed. Criticism of Rhine's work is perhaps somewhat unfair, I feel, because after all, he was starting from scratch. He basically had no precedent to sort of follow, and he had to kind of devise experiments himself and devise the methodologies and treat them with statistical methods which hadn't perhaps been used in this context. So he was learning as he went along. So just a little bit more about him. Rhine used students as any self-respecting university lecturer, professor would do. Who can I use as subjects? Oh, this lot in front of me, students. And in fact, in his research, and he found one or two exceptional performers actually in his card guessing test using the 5 Zener card designs, which I had up yesterday. Perhaps the best known series of experiments were ESP tests involving a guy called Hubert Pierce and another person, a research assistant, Joseph Gaither Pratt. And these were carried out in 1934-5, so well before the Second World War. Pierce was the subject sitting in the campus library, while Pratt at some distance, it varied a little bit, but from about 100 yards to 200 yards or something like that. Yards, I say, in 1934. Where Pratt was shuffling and recording the order of the cards in the parapsychology laboratory. There are a number of trial runs with varying results, but it seems the total number of guesses was 1,850, of which one would expect 1/5, 5 cards, 1/5, or 370 to be correct by chance. The actual number of hits was 558, and the probability of these results occurring by chance is much less than 1 in 100 million. It's hard in some ways to sort of visualize what that sort of actually means, but the more, as I understand it, the more tests that you do, the more runs that you do, the sharper will become the peak of the distribution of data. And so even a small deviation from the mean sort of falls well outside that peak. The peak, of course, is more like a bell curve if you've got fewer data. Anyway, that's a digression. Rhine's work has been criticized on several counts. A number of psychology departments attempted to repeat Rhine's experiments and failed. And this is one of the big bugbears of parapsychology. It seems that results are sometimes not repeatable, and of course this is one of the big criteria of the scientific method. And your formal materialist scientist sort of says, well, if it's not repeatable, we can't believe it. But this is a sort of a cross that parapsychologists have to bear in many ways, because after all, they're dealing with people. They're not dealing with inanimate objects, you know, sort of sitting on a laboratory bench. Anyway, some have criticized his methods, others his record keeping, and yet others his statistical analysis. These criticisms were initially countered by two mathematicians, Dr. Joseph Greenwood and, interestingly, Dr. Thomas Greville, who was a theosophist. So we had theosophical members sort of involved in these things back in the 1930s. Then in 1937, an analysis by the Institute of Mathematical Statistics, which I assume is the American one, concluded that, quote, if the Rhine investigation is to be fairly attacked, it must be on other than mathematical grounds. So it looks as though his statistics was okay, so if you want to criticize his work, it has to be his experimental methodology. Mind you, I find in reading about this stuff, I get extremely irritated because there will always be some smart aleck who's got some way of criticizing parapsychology results. Oh, you know, the results could have been reflected in a mirror on the wall, or this sort of thing. And it kind of, I don't think I'll study this anymore. I get fed up with the critics. You know, they're absolutely determined to prove parapsychologists wrong. Anyway, in 1940, Rhine and his associates published Extrasensory Perception After 60 Years, reviewing all the data from 1882 onwards and dealing in detail with all the published criticism. In the early 60s, Rhine left Duke and founded the Institute for Parapsychology, which later became the Independent Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man. That was what it was when I was doing this work in the 1980s. This has now evolved into the Rhine Research Center, and he passed away in 1980, in fact. So there you go. So what happened after Rhine? Rhine was a pioneer. While there's usually a clear distinction between research into ESP and PK on the one hand, and survival research on the other, see our classification of phenomena, and I think I've got it back here again. Do you mind if I sit down now? Thank you. Some phenomena seem to fall into both categories. For example, out-of-the-body experiences. Obviously, OBEs could be seen as verifying survival after death, because from the OBE, you could deduce that there's something in the body which separates from the physical body. So it could be seen as evidence for survival. But they were also once called traveling clairvoyance, because not only if something leaves the body and sees something remote, some sort of remote viewing, there's an element of clairvoyance perhaps come into this as well. One of the earlier research centers was established by Harry Price. Not a very good photo of him, but I absolutely loved Harry Price when I came across him. Must have been early 70s or something. And of course, what drew my attention was his work on the most haunted house in England, Borley Rectory in Essex. So his work is very much in the survival category. He was a British psychical researcher and author who became known for his investigations into phenomena and exposing fraudulence. Price, of course, made use of what was relatively new technology then, sort of audio recording, audio and video recording, filming. He joined the Society for Psychical Research in 1920 and was an expert in conjuring and sleight of hand. And he used this expertise, of course, in an endeavor to expose fraudulent so-called phenomena. However, Price fell out with the SPR 6 years later and left to form his own National Laboratory of Psychical Research. And as I said just now, he's best known for his investigation of reported happenings at Borley Rectory in Essex. Look at that, isn't that beautiful? I don't know when that was taken, but there are ladies in long dresses and things there in the grounds. It was, I don't know whether it still is a ruin, but it was a ruin for a long time. The roof had fallen in and all that sort of thing. Is it? Oh, thank you. Yeah. It should have been. I mean, you know, it's an interesting place. Oh, really? Oh, okay. Anyway, Price published a book in 1940, The Most Haunted House in England. His investigation of Borley was the subject of a 2013 best-selling novel by Neil Spring entitled The Ghost Hunters. Has anybody come across The Ghost Hunters? You'll have to Google it, won't you? And this novel was then subsequently adapted for television as Harry Price Ghost Hunter, and I think I must have seen that as well. When Price made a formal offer to the University of London to equip and endow a Department of Psychical Research, the university was sympathetic, which was good. And in 1934, it took several years for negotiations and all that sort of stuff, Price's National Laboratory for Psychical Research became the University of London Council for Psychical Investigation. I don't think it was ever a formal department of the university, but it was an organization affiliated with the university, which gave it some standing, obviously. Anyway, move on to the 1960s. There was increased financial support for parapsychology and an expansion of the number of research centers. Chester F. Carlson, anybody know what he invented? Chester F. Carlson, inventor of the Xerox process. In 1961, endowed a number of positions within the American Society for Psychical Research, which was founded in 1885. I couldn't remember that yesterday. And also positions at the University of Virginia in 1967. Another important development was the setting up of the Dream Laboratory in 1962 at the Maimonides Medical Center in New York by Montague Ullman. He was the guy who sort of used electroencephalographs, ECGs, to detect brain waves and things when they have the subject sort of goes to bed in a lovely comfortable dream laboratory, and when they detect this rapid eye movement, remember the REM, they measure the brain waves, and they have a photograph or a picture in a sealed envelope, and the subject during that REM stage endeavors to see what the photograph is in the envelope. For over 30 years, Ullman actively promoted public interest in dreams and dream-sharing groups. He worked with Stanley Krippner, who is another well-known name, in carrying out dream telepathy experiments. And Stanley Krippner is still alive. If you jump online, there's a YouTube clip of Stanley Krippner describing his work, actually. It's quite interesting. Ullman actually left Maimonides, and he went out on his own, and he worked a lot with small groups on dream therapy and dream sharing and so on. Critics claim that there were weaknesses in the design of the Ullman and Krippner experiments. As usual, they always say things like that. Ullman was the president of both the Parapsychological Association and of the American Society for Psychical Research. So he was very much involved over much of his lifetime. Also in the 60s came the work of Professor Ian Stevenson. His studies on reincarnation, of course, became prominent. And he was the founder and director of the division of perceptual studies. And then he said perpetual studies. Perceptual studies at the University of Virginia, which investigates the paranormal. I guess they investigate other things than reincarnation. He published a number of books detailing his work, and of course we've all heard of his best known 20 cases suggestive of reincarnation, published in 1966. Many of Stevenson's studies involve investigating the memories of young children, which he regarded as the most strongly suggestive of reincarnation. And I've got a little personal story I can tell you about that. I've got about 10 grandchildren at the moment, and the oldest is going steady with a nice young plumber. But my story is that the young lady who's going steady, when she was 3, something like that, she was around. We babysat the children for the grandchildren, of course, as most grandparents do. And she was round our place one day, and we were cleaning up the backyard. And she came out, there was a broom, and she picked up the broom, and she went round the backyard, sort of, you know, doing this. Only 3, I mean, the broom was twice as high as she was. She was going around doing this. And I said to her, "Oh, Kelsey," I said, you're doing a really good job sweeping the yard. Who told you how to do that?" And she said, "My old mother." I went goosepimply all over. And I said, "You don't mean Tracy, your mother?" "Oh no, my old mother," she said. And she said one or two sort of things like that over a space of a few weeks. Of course, now she's totally forgotten them. But that was a great example of what Stevenson discovered in children about reincarnation studies. Anyway, he traveled extensively over a period of 40 years and investigated an amazing 3,000 or so cases of child memory. He passed away in 2007 at the age of 88. So, you know, I like Stevenson's work. Over to Scotland now, a guy called John Beloff. He'd been interested in parapsychology from an early age, and he worked at the University of Edinburgh from 1926 until his retirement. My brother had held a chair of archaeology there for a great many years, and he's still writing books. He's had one published by Oxford University Press just recently. He's a bit younger than me. Beloff's first book, The Existence of Mind, was published in 1962, and it attracted the attention of J.B. Rhine, who invited Beloff to visit the laboratory in Durham in North Carolina. And he went there in '65. Beloff had already been conducting research in parapsychology. For example, in 1961, he and a physics student, Leonard Evans, carried out an innovative experiment in psychokinesis. This is an interesting step in the development of research. In this experiment, radioactive decay served as a source of randomness. And the objective was to influence the radioactive source so that its particle emissions were non-random. This was the first instance of what later became a standard approach to PK research, and it marked an important advance over using more mathematically and physically complex objects like falling dice and coins, for example. Some of the earliest PK work they tried to get psychics to influence the fall of dice and things like that. Well, if anyone has just tried tossing dice, like if you're playing Monopoly with the grandchildren, you know that dice go all over the place. Especially when the kids sort of want to do a little bit of cheeking and they make sure it's gone under the table so grandpa can't see it. Oh, that was definitely double six. Yeah. What's interesting also about Bellof is that he had a reputation as a psi inhibitor. That is, an experimenter whose very presence seemed to discourage the appearance of evidence for psychic functioning. None of his experiments yielded positive results. However, this work actually has been cited more often than any other of his experimental papers. And the phenomenon called psi missing is intriguing because it involves not merely null or chance results, but actually scoring significantly below chance. The score swings away on the other side of the median. Just as psi hitters score on the high side, of course. And this brings up the experimenter effect. And this is another, quantum physics is often sort of quoted as an example where the experimenter influences the experiment, and the observer is an integral part of the experiment. Well, here we have a similar sort of thing. The observer, in some ways, seems to be an integral part of the experiment, and so the person conducting the experiment can actually influence the result to the negative. So you can psi miss as well as psi hit. Excuse me. And of course, was it? I think it's come up already. Wolfgang Pauli, I think it was him, a famous investigator into quantum physics and atomic structure, Pauli exclusion principle, I remember. They would never let him into the laboratory because when he went into the lab, something always fell apart, broke, or went wrong. So they would be keeping watch out the window, say, look out, here comes the boss. So they would stop the experiment while he came in. Is that an example of psi missing? Maybe it is. Bellof served a term as president of the Society for Psychical Research, so 74 to 76. But one of the most interesting things is that he was executor of Arthur Koestler's will in 1983. You remember Arthur Koestler, The Roots of Coincidence, The Case of the Midwife Toad. What else did he write? Can't remember. Several famous books. Yeah, and I remember reading them in the 70s. Anyway, when Koestler died, he left his money to the university, and with it, the first UK chair of parapsychology was set up in Edinburgh in 1985, the Koestler Parapsychology Unit. Moving on, also in the field of psychokinesis, and this would be an interesting one for you. Uri Geller became a sensation in the 70s for his entertaining spoon-bending demonstrations and his claim to repair watches by PK. You remember that? Now, while one is inclined to chuckle at his performances, his work was investigated by serious researchers, including Russell Targ, a physicist, and Harold Puthoff, an engineer at the Stanford Research Institute, now known as SRI International. It seems that at least some of Geller's demonstrations were genuinely paranormal. I don't know whether that's an adequate conclusion. May well have been paranormal, I think I would say. The stage magician James Randi, I think he was mentioned at some stage, strongly criticized Geller and claimed he was using stage tricks that could be produced by any competent magician. Incidentally, Russell Targ who was involved in this investigation. I think he's still alive. Yeah, he went on to, he remained a well-known parapsychologist, and in fact his most recent book was published by Quest in 2012 called The Reality of ESP. There's another bit on the title too, I can't remember that. Sort of Google Russell Targ. Anyway, others claimed that Puthoff and Targ tests were not well designed. Of course, they always come up with the same old criticisms, you see. However, at the 1980 meeting of the Parapsychological Association, several papers were devoted to reporting Geller-like phenomena, apparently performed by college students. Experimental work on out-of-the-body experience began with Charles Tart. Oops, that's Russell Targ. Yeah, that's, there you are. He was born in 1934. Yes, he's still going. And here we've got Charles Tart. He was at the University of Virginia, and he started the experimentation in 1968. His first books, Altered States of Consciousness, 1969, and Transpersonal Psychologies, 1975, became widely used texts in psychology. And I can remember reading Altered States of Consciousness back then, which is where I discovered Charles Tart. He conducted an OBE experiment with a subject known as Miss Z, or I suppose in America would be Miss Z, for 4 nights in his sleep laboratory. The subject was attached to an EEG machine, and a 5-digit code was placed on a shelf above her bed. She did not claim to see the number on the first 3 nights, but on the 4th gave the number correctly. During the experiment, Tart monitored the equipment from the next room behind an observation window. However, he admitted he had occasionally dozed during the night. The psychologists have claimed that the possibility of the subject having obtained the number through ordinary sensory means was not ruled out in the experiment. That's when they sort of said, oh, she could see reflections in the clock face or something, you know. However, I don't really sort of see this as a particularly impressive experiment. I mean, 4 nights and sort of 1 hit. Mind you, it was a 5-digit code, so I suppose the probability of hitting at all was quite amazing. Probably better known is the work by SPR and ASPR member Dr. Hereward Carrington and Sylvan Muldoon, describing the latter's OBEs in Projection of the Astral Body, published in 1929. And that book, I think, has been on every TS library shelf for as long as I can remember. It was followed later by Celia Green's Out-of-the-Body Experiences in 1968, and Robert A. Munro's Journeys Out of the Body in 1971. And that was where I came into the scene. It was just about that time I raised my head and walked out of the Catholic Church and started looking around, and Robert Munro's book jumped at me out of the shelf. In 1973, Carlos Osis was another guy, and several associates began a series of experiments in New York at the ASPR headquarters with the cooperation of psychics Ingo Swann and later Alex Tanous. Ingo Swann was a very well-known psychic for a number of years in the States. The subject, with a polygraph machine attached in one room, was asked to project himself to another room where the target was located. This was a box containing a device which would project randomized combinations of slides onto a small screen to produce an optical illusion when seen through its viewing window, but not otherwise. It must have been a stereo arrangement. However, the illusion was reported, suggesting the subject had indeed left his body and viewed the target through the window of the device, because that was the only way of seeing what it was. This seemed to be confirmed when a sensitive strain gauge placed where the subject would have to be to correctly identify the target registered a presence, I guess, on the floor or something like that. The beginning of the so-called space age also impacted on parapsychology research to a very great degree, actually. Our friend Edgar Mitchell, lunar module pilot of Apollo 14. That was so exciting, wasn't it? The landing on the moon in 1971, that was. He underwent a transformative experience when he saw Earth from space as he was traveling back from the moon. You probably know this story. As he watched the Earth float freely in the vastness of space, he experienced a profound sense of universal connectedness. That moment for Mitchell was an epiphany. Further, he is said to have conducted private ESP experiments with his friends on Earth. So he's already interested in ESP. And the results of these were published in the Journal of Parapsychology. He went on to become the first CEO of the California-based Institute of Noetic Sciences, IONS. IONS and the TS have developed quite a close relationship, in fact. And our international president, Tim Boyd, was invited to speak at the 2015 IONS conference, so it was only last year. The researchers associated with IONS include Rupert Sheldrake, you probably know him well too, and Dean Radin, who is currently its chief scientist. So we'll talk about Dean Radin's work in a second. Anyway, because of the link between IONS and the TS, I thought it was worth having a closer look at his work. Biodata on his website tells us that before joining the research staff at IONS in 2001, he held appointments at AT&T Bell Labs, Princeton University, the University of Edinburgh, and SRI International, the Stanford research place. He's the author or co-author of over 250 technical and popular articles, 36 book chapters, and 3 books, including the award-winning The Conscious Universe, published in 1997. Has anyone read The Conscious Universe? Yes. Entangled Minds, 2006. I've got that on my shelf too. It looks like there's another Dean Radin fan down there. And the award-winning Supernormal, which I have here, which is published in 2013. Interestingly, Radin started his career as a concert violinist. He obtained a degree in electrical engineering with honors in physics, a man after my own heart, from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, followed by a master's in electrical engineering and a PhD in psychology at the University of Illinois. Now, I mention all this, I mean, sort of bio stuff is a bit boring, but I do mention it to emphasize that Radin is well qualified to carry out research in parapsychology, and is well able to rebut the inevitable criticism aimed at his work by skeptics. I picked up Radin's most recent book, this Supernormal. The subtitle is Science, Yoga, and the Evidence for Extraordinary Psychic Abilities. Anyway, I found that this book very well demonstrates where science and spirituality meet, actually. In it, Radin, says the blurb, presents persuasive new experimental evidence for the existence of phenomena. He challenges outdated assumptions that these psi abilities are mere superstitions. What is most interesting to me is that Radin uses the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali as a framework for his discussion. And these 2,000-year-old, whatever, meditation practices provide a handy classification for supernormal mental powers and a means of developing them. At least for some, they can release extraordinary powers, generally known as siddhis, of course. Radin interprets the language used by Patanjali in modern terms. He then shows that parapsychology research offers powerful evidence confirming the reality of those siddhis. That is evidence for the existence of powers such as telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition. Yoga Sutras consist of 4 books called Padas, consisting of 196 aphorisms in total. The second book describes the practice of yoga in terms of the Eightfold Path, or Ashtanga. The siddhis are attained after reaching samyana, or inner transformation, by mastery of the last 3 steps of this path, namely concentration, meditation, and samadhi. We had something of that this morning, I think. In Supernormal, Radin says that approximately 25 siddhis are listed in Pada 3, or Book 3, and he suggests that all these can be listed under 3 basic headings. First of all, exceptional mind-body control. There's 6, he counts 6 of the sutras referring to that. Second, clairvoyance, and he counts 15 under clairvoyance. And the third, telekinesis, in which there are 4 references. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 there, so I must have counted differently from him. There's not really time to go through the sutras here, of course, but maybe, have I got time just to read a sample? I've got something here. Here we go. For example, Pada 3, Sutras 19 and 20, refers to knowledge of minds resulting from samyana on one's own mind or another's mind, both of which, from a holistic perspective, are part of the universal mind. And Radin sees in this the reference to what we call telepathy. Knowledge of the composition and coordination of bodily energies through samyana on the navel chakra or manipura chakra. This siddhi may be interpreted as an exceptional mind-body connection or as a self-healing ability. It's interesting, isn't it? Liberation from hunger and thirst through samyana on the throat. This siddhi is known as Innedia within the Catholic tradition. The Catholic saints have been known to achieve this siddhi. And more popularly as breatharianism. Anyone met a breatharian? I remember I met one in Canberra once. I'm not quite sure how long she survived. Living on breath alone without food, and in extreme cases without water. So the siddhis are, I could go on reading. What have we got here? 343, freedom from bodily awareness and temporal attachments. This could be interpreted as a state of perception from out of the body, or as a form of clairvoyance, maybe traveling clairvoyance. Influencing others. Oh, maybe we should read that one. It's too long, actually. I won't. I better continue. I've still got a couple of pages to go here. Anyway, in answering critics, Radin says that, quote, a common complaint is that science has been studying these phenomena for over a century, and that the fact that the mere existence of these superpowers is still mired in controversy tells us that the siddhis don't exist, unquote. And he says that this doesn't hold water, even when we look at the history of science. He cites the case of magnetism, in which, quote, it took half a millennium for science to learn enough about magnetism to make it practically useful, from the lodestone of early China through to making compasses and things. And he adds that unlike psi, magnetism is easy to demonstrate. He also cites gravity, cancer, consciousness as other examples of how long it takes science to achieve even a glimmering of understanding of these phenomena. I mean, there are some of those things that we really don't understand, do we? I mean, we talked about gravity the other day. I mean, You know, we know that bodies attract with a force proportional to the, you know, product of their masses over the inverse square of over the square of the distance, whatever. But I mean, what is it? What is it? And this was the, I'm diverting again. This was the problem David Bohm had with quantum physics. What he said was that, yes, you can solve the Schrödinger equation. I used to solve the Schrödinger equation when I was at university. I don't think I could do it anymore. You can solve the equation and pop out with answers that, you know, sort of fit observations. But an equation is equation. What is the reality? What's really going on here? And Bohm sort of kept on about this for many years. Another story, I think I've given a talk on that somewhere. Anyway, Radin says that in the understanding of psi and the cities, we've only just begun in terms of history, you know. He points out that it is true that some of the extreme cities, like the ability not to eat or drink for indefinite periods of time, one which I happen to, breatharianism, are difficult to investigate. I guess the subject would die before you got any results. Die of starvation. But many actually are amenable to controlled laboratory testing. Precognition, for example, definitely exists, says Radin. And you might have seen some of his YouTube clips where he monitors like skin resistance or something like that, and there's a big jump in skin resistance before the subject is shown a shocking picture or something, or a frightening picture. And there's definitely a time difference between the response and the actual event. He's got some of those sort of graphs in here. Where are we? Better move on. Oh, that's an interesting point about precognition, is that it implies that time reversal must occur in the macroscopic world as well as in quantum physics. Right? I mean, if you know, somehow or other, we know something's going to happen in 5 years or 5 minutes or whatever, then that information must have traveled back to us somehow or other. Well, okay. Yes, well, we'll talk about that another time, perhaps. So anyway, we go to telepathy. The likelihood that telepathy exists is as close to proven as science can establish. I think we heard that quote sometime recently. Radin claims that over many decades, experimental methods have evolved to as close to perfect as anyone can devise. Similarly, says Radin, historical, anecdotal case study and scientific evidence shows clairvoyance is real. Amazing results are also claimed for the study of mind-matter interactions, psychokinesis, and modern research has included double-slit experiments and experiments with a Michelson interferometer. The gravity waves were detected using the Michelson interferometer principle, and it was a lot bigger than an optical interferometer in the lab. The interferometer generates two beams of light going in perpendicular directions, and they're reflected back from mirrors at the end of tubes, and when it comes back, the light interferes. And you get an interference pattern of fringes. And if one of the mirrors is moved by the tiniest fraction, the fringe pattern changes. So the gravity waves that they detected, they used the slightest tremor of a gravity wave shifted the mirror enough to shift to come up on the interferometer. And you can use this for psychokinesis experiments. If you get a target, obviously sort of focusing on one of the mirrors, if you can shift it only a minutest sort of fraction of a millimeter, it'll show up on the interference pattern. So modern methods actually, things are getting better and better in terms of technology. Radin concludes, so far we've learned that there are rational, evidence-based reasons to accept that some of the cities, the ones which have been repeatedly tested under controlled conditions, are real. Further, he says, we've seen evidence suggesting that advanced meditation may be associated with improved psi performance, and that was a whole lot of experiments he did. He used meditators, and he found that meditators actually were better at doing these things than non-meditators. Yes, that's right. So it shows the importance of meditation in if you like, mastering the monkey mind. And finally, from the scientific perspective, the mere existence of these phenomena, regardless of how weak or unreliable they may be, is astounding. For a long time, off and on over the years, I've been interested in reconciling science and religion. And in a recent talk at the Australian Section Convention, I concluded that Theosophy provided a path to such reconciliation. And as humanity evolves, we'll be able to bring such reconciliation closer. And I think that these phenomena that we're just beginning to detect are just the beginning of the human evolution towards more and more obvious, more and more powerful psychic abilities. It's part of our future state, if you like. And I think that this work is all pointing towards it. We're just at the very beginning of it. Further, I believe that scientific investigation of phenomena and parapsychology are areas where science and spirituality truly meet. I mean, how closer could you get than scientific investigation of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras? You know, the science of parapsychology has come a long way since the Vatican started investigating miracles. An enormous number of experiments have been conducted with ever-increasing sophistication. And bearing in mind the inevitable criticisms that come their way, parapsychologists have paid scrupulous attention to ensuring that nothing in their work can be faulted. Experiments in parapsychology are conducted with far more care than any in mainstream science, and far greater attention is paid to statistical analysis. Science has established that paranormal events happen, that paranormal abilities are real, with odds against chance in many cases being millions to one. That is not to say that as our present level of knowledge we understand how these things happen, nor to deny the effects are often weak and unreliable. But we know they happen, and that's a start, isn't it? There are many more while there are many more psi investigations today, carried out over a wider field with greater precision and better technology than in Blavatsky's day, there still seems to be reluctance on the part of many materialist scientists to accept the reality of phenomena. And I love this quote from William James. There is no source of deception in investigation of nature which can compare with a fixed belief that certain kinds of phenomena are impossible. I love it. Maybe these skeptics should be bundled up into space in the hope that they too, like Edward Mitchell, will have their transformative experience. Thank you.